All right, thank you very much, Eliza, for that introduction and for the opportunity to present today at InterCOMM. My name is Jennifer Dumoulin, and I am a sixth year and final year PhD candidate in the Department of Communications. The title of my presentation today is Pandemic Narratives, Adapting Metaphors in Fictional Worlds to the Contemporary Pandemic. Today's presentation comes from my doctoral research project. So it is one of the foundational chapters that leads into the research questions that I've ended up exploring. So COVID-19, what don't we know about COVID-19? Essentially, just as a reminder in case we've forgotten, COVID-19 was first identified in December 2019 in Wuhan, China. And then on January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19, the outbreak, as a public health emergency of international concern. And then a few months later, on March 11th, 2020, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. But what exactly is a pandemic? A pandemic is the worldwide spread of a new disease. So it's the global spread or the growth of a disease, essentially when that disease covers a wide area and starts to affect several countries and populations. That word is different than other terminology that is used to characterize diseases. An epidemic, for example, is an unexpected increase in a number of diseases in a specific geographical area. Interestingly, with epidemics, a disease does not have to be contagious. So obesity, for example, can be an epidemic, whereas a pandemic has a tendency to be a contagious disease. Now, COVID-19 isn't like other diseases, despite comparisons at the beginning of the pandemic to outbreaks like the Spanish flu. While COVID's transmission is quick, we're still learning about the long-term effects today. In addition, COVID-19, one of the most contemporary examples of a pandemic, is further complicated by international travel, as we've seen by social media and technology, which has amplified conspiracy theories and allowed for disinformation to run rampant on and off of the internet. How do we get out of this? How do we finish with COVID-19? I'm not a doctor. Not only am I not a doctor of communications, but I'm not a scientist or a doctor that specializes in the spread of diseases. However, my understanding is that the best way to get out of COVID-19 is to get vaccinations, as many as possible, in not only Canada, where many of us are located currently, but globally. So just vaccinating the wealthy countries, for example, isn't going to solve the pandemic. However, for the purpose of my dissertation project, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the context that exists in the Western world. So in order to get vaccination, so to get shots into arms so that we can boost community protection, so we can all achieve immunity without infection, and by extension, without overloading our hospitals and healthcare systems, and we could certainly have a discussion about whether we've hit that point or not already. In order to get to the last step, we need to get information out there. Mass communication is an integral part of every public health response. That's not new, and it comes in different formats. Once we have that information, we're able to mobilize through word of mouth, healthcare professionals, and trusted experts. Those are some of the more traditional approaches. And there's a lot of scholarship that explains how a lot of the anti-vax, anti-mask type rhetoric has grown and mobilized, and the effectiveness of traditional sources of information like public health experts versus our own communication networks and social networks. So there's kind of been an issue there in terms of getting information to the people that need it, but also having those people understand, internalize, and accept it. So the purpose of this presentation is to really propose or explore the possibility of an alternative, which is to use popular culture as a source of information about illness and disease in the media. And it's not a new proposition. It's been happening for a very long time. We've learned from television programs, from books, from films, how diseases are spread. how vaccinations work, how they're created. We've learned about the interactions that doctors should or could have with their patients through programs like ER and Grey's Anatomy, and perhaps the kinds of interactions that doctors and patients shouldn't have as well. But ultimately, popular culture is one of the tools that we can use, or that has been used, to influence perceptions and behavior. One of the challenges with pop culture, as well as with other sources of information, if we think about news clips with regards to news coverage of COVID-19, or social media, which is often limited in terms of characters, or can be suppressed or raised by algorithms. Oftentimes the narratives that we see are oversimplified or inaccurate.
It was a groundbreaking ceremony for a new factory.
Did she mention seeing anyone who was sick? Anyone on a plane, the airport?
No, she said she was jet lagged.
The average person touches their face 3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doorknobs, water fountains, and each other.
Beth. Mom? No, go up to your room, honey.
So we have a virus with no treatment protocol and no vaccine at this time.
You had a seizure this morning, Beth.
She had a history of seizures,
No.
allergies.
As of last night, there were 32 cases.
Unfortunately, she did die.
Right. He said, can I go talk to her?
Mr. Amoff, your wife is dead.
What are you talking about?
Okay.
What happened to her? What happened to her?
Is there any way someone could weaponize the bird flu? Is that what we're looking at?
Someone doesn't have to weaponize the bird flu. The birds are doing that.
Watch this. It's transmission, so we just need to know which direction.
On day 1, there were 2 people, and then 4, and then 16. In 3 months, it's 1 billion. That's where we're headed.
They're calling out the National Guard. They're moving the president underground.
With similar origin and transmission stories to COVID-19, in films like Contagion, which really raised in popularity following kind of like the emergence of the pandemic, there was a push and a realization, or if not a re-realization, that popular culture is a site for learning. This has, again, been discussed for a very long time. It's not isolated to health-related phenomena. We've seen it in the context of the CSI effect, for example, where lawyers and other legal professionals, law enforcement officials have been concerned about the impact of television programs like CSI on jurors, as well as on, their colleagues across the aisle. So this kind of phenomenon isn't isolated to healthcare settings, but 2 theories do help to explain why pop culture can function as a source of information. So the first is Cultivation Theory by Gerbner, which is based on the idea that the views and behaviors of those who spend time with media, and we all spend time with media, different forms, whether it's film, television, comics, video games, books, have a tendency to internalize and then reflect what they've seen in those mediums. So essentially, these media-aided environments present a specific version of reality for the purpose of their stories that they're trying to tell. But the more we see that reality, the more we are likely to believe it. Cultivation theory works in collaboration or in concert with social cognitive theory from Bandura, which basically describes, where he describes that these social realities that we're seeing in these mediums can allow us, audiences, the public, to learn. So we can learn certain types of behaviors, and by extension, certain types of expectations when we're confronted with a situation. If we've never been in that situation before, we learn how to react and how we should behave in those contexts. And so when COVID-19 really spread across the world and started to hit North America, Canada, United States in particular, there was lots of stories in the news about shelves being, about stores and their shelves going empty. We see that in a lot of zombie outbreak movies, as well as in movies like in Contagion. You know, the clip that you saw from the trailer talked about fomites and transmission. That was in the news as well. And so if we as an audience or as a people have never been exposed to a pandemic situation and we don't know how to react in those circumstances, we're going to learn what we should be doing from someplace, and that someplace could be popular culture. This, again, is not a new theory, and the impact of pop culture and films like Contagion was recognized very early on in the pandemic. The Columbia Mailman School of Health actually worked with many of the actors that were in Contagion to release a series of public service announcements because they realized how powerful that film could be and some of the narratives or stories or information that was being conveyed in the film itself.
Hey everybody, this is Matt Damon. So a few years ago, a bunch of us did this movie called Contagion, which we've noticed is creeping its way back up on the charts on iTunes for obvious reasons, given what we're all living through right now. And so the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University reached out to the cast and asked us if we would have a virtual reunion to do some PSAs for everybody that might be helpful. And so we readily agreed, and so here they are. So everything you're going to hear from us has been vetted by public health experts and scientists. So I'm here to talk to you about social distancing, something we've been hearing a lot about on TV, I think, the last couple of weeks. In the movie, I played a guy who was immune to the hypothetical virus that was spreading around the world. And so a few things to start. One, that was a movie. This is real life. I have no reason to believe that I'm immune to COVID-19, and neither do you, no matter how young you are. This is a new virus. It's going to take some time for our bodies and our doctors to understand it and to understand the best way to protect us. So new viruses emerge all the time.
That's just a sample of the PSAs that were created. And you can see the icons that have popped up on the bottom here. If you're interested in looking up the campaign, it is quite fascinating. It's called Control the Contagion. And all of the PSAs are still available on YouTube, as well as the Columbia School of Health website. Looking at and seeing the similarities between Contagion and COVID-19, and also watching all of these news articles fly by that suggested that Contagion predicted COVID-19 and what was going to happen in the media, led me to wonder what kind of narratives, especially in popular culture, can best reflect the nature, effects, and impacts of contemporary pandemics. So thinking about COVID-19, knowing, because I'm listening to the experts, I'm following that advice, that vaccinations are one of the best ways, if not the best way, to stop the spread of COVID-19, to get us out of this pandemic, and wondering why and how to reach people that don't have that belief. I felt that popular culture could be a tool. And so that's what I explore in my dissertation. Now, what kind of pop culture narratives are effective? So again, a lot of research in the fields of media studies and pop culture studies about, what makes a pop culture an effective medium for communication. How and why do we learn from it? It's not just one single instance, so we can't read one book or one advertisement and be influenced, but rather it's the habitual and cyclical consumption of these narratives. That could be within one text, or that can be across movies or several different types of texts over the course of a lifetime. So Ames and Birkin, as an example, look at this phenomena in the context of the depiction of women in the media, and they find that it's not just by reading Disney stories or watching Disney films, and that women sometimes grow up with these gendered stereotype expectations. It's because they're exposed to Disney films and advertisements that depicts women in a certain way, as well as music videos and romantic comedies. So it's this repetition of a similar message that makes those narratives effective. And by effective here, I mean it makes them stick in your brain and you start to internalize them. Other factors that make narratives effective are relatability. So narratives are essentially stories. Good stories generate empathy and emotion. They also have to be believable to a greater or lesser extent. So studies have looked at the depiction of climate change in pop culture. For example, the film The Day After Tomorrow, and those researchers found that the impact of The Day After Tomorrow wasn't lasting. Now, this could be because of a lack of repetition, but it could also be because the situations and claims in that film were so exaggerated that they weren't relatable, that they didn't actually generate empathy and emotion. In order to be effective, there has to be transportation. So the audience has to travel, not literally travel, but in their mind, travel into the world that's being created. This relates to the depth of which a story is told, so the amount of detail that's there, the amount of description, as well as repetition. And if we think of good, I say good is a very subjective word. If we think of classic science fiction, fantasy literature like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, right, which is quickly becoming a classic, Harry Potter, the world that's created transports the reader into that place, and they feel like they're there. So when you have an immersive story of environment, you're more likely to get the reader's attention. You're pulling them in rather than pushing content at them. And if we think about health communication, public health narratives, our public health experts are pushing information at us all the time. And while it's been effective for some, it hasn't been effective for everybody. So a more immersive pulling environment is what's needed. In addition, the research that I've done suggests that metaphors can be effective as well, especially for reaching populations that may not be receptive to these so-called like mainstream forms of media. So if you look at the depiction of other diseases in the media, like HIV and AIDS, when HIV and AIDS was first growing as its own pandemic or epidemic, depending on how you decide to characterize it, it was taboo to talk about LGBTQ communities. It was taboo to talk about certain types of sex, if not any sex at all, on television and in other forms of media. And so using a metaphor instead provides a bit of distance from those types of topics. And in the context of HIV and AIDS, vampires were very frequently associated with that disease, with that illness as a metaphor because of a lot of the other characteristics that were built up around vampire mythology. Metaphors give you a familiar frame, so they allow you to easily and quickly understand a phenomenon by comparing it to another. If we talk about mutants and X-Men, for example, we're talking about genetic mutation potentially, or a marginalized community, depending on how you interpret that metaphor. Susan Sontag points out, though, that metaphors and metaphorical language can actually impose meaning on the experience of people who are being compared. So when you think about diseases and illnesses, and you're fighting a war against a disease or illness, well, the people that have that disease or illness, kind of like my colleague Brigitte was speaking about with regards to the social and medical models of disability, if you're talking about a person as a victim, it's going to impact how you treat them medically, socially, legally. In the context of HIV and AIDS, a lot of people with those diseases were demonized or monstricized especially when HIV and AIDS was first growing, and we didn't really understand its cause and how it could be transmitted and its long-term effect, because it didn't really have one. So it was feared, and so by referring to things or people or diseases as monsters, you're automatically transferring some meaning onto those people or those diseases and conditions. So in order to be effective, in order to stop or limit this idea that you can impose meaning that's counterproductive in metaphorical narratives, I suggest, based on the research that I've done for my dissertation, that you need several different things to be effective, to hit those check marks. So intricate and prolonged world building, where the audience is pulled into a story and the world over time. That meets the repetition requirement, that the metaphorical imagery and language actually facilitates the world building. So in the context of illness and disease, you'll likely want to alternate or find a balance between explicit reference to a disease or illness, and general references to maybe transmission, more scientific or medical knowledge or medical language or imagery being used. Again, and that's that balance between pushing and pulling your reader or your message to your reader or your audience. You also want to allow for character development and growth by depicting characters or people in your stories in their full humanity. You're able to get that emotion and that empathy that allows for a successful narrative. And then repeated exposure is key. So serial format, irrespective of the medium, whether we're talking about television, novels, comics, films potentially, or even separate texts with similar metaphors could be effective ways to change perceptions surrounding contemporary pandemics and illness and disease by extension. The case study that I conducted was on a book series called Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter. It meets many of the requirements, and part of the reason that it was selected was it met some of the prima facie requirements. So being a serial novel, having repetition there, just because it does span 30 years and it includes multiple books. It was metaphorical. It features werewolves, vampires, zombies, fairies, you name it. They're probably in the series, but it also hit all of these other boxes, and that's what's come out of my analysis of the series. It's relatable for various reasons. So even though the main character is a vampire hunter and vampires don't exist in our reality, the audience or the reader gets to know her very, very well over the course of 30 novels. And therefore we come to relate to her as well as to many of the primary and secondary characters who also evolve over time, just like us. The novels mirror reality, so they incorporate factual and fictional events from real life history and popular culture, but we're still able to suspend belief. So it has a connection to our reality, which I argue strengthens the metaphor, and then just the intricate details of the world that's been created, which I'd be happy to chat about offline, result in transportation. In order to understand what's happening in the series, you literally do travel into it. So how do we use these narratives? Well, they're not well suited to an outbreak stage of a pandemic. So in an emergency situation, popular culture is probably not your best tool. I also recognize that, the messages that we get regarding pandemics and emergencies, generally speaking, come from our public health officials and governments. And I don't think the government is going to fund a 30, book series or film series about vampires and werewolves to help people get vaccinated against COVID-19. However, these types of narratives, if we can target them strategically or harness them strategically and involve the artists that are creating them, may be a tool for reaching peripheral populations. So populations where our traditional communications have been unsuccessful. If they don't want to hear about COVID-19, maybe they'll be willing to hear about vampires and werewolves and the experience that those characters and those types of people go through in this alternative series. That's how I think we could use those narratives. So thank you very much to the Communication Graduate Students Association for the opportunity to present on my research today. I would welcome any questions, comments, or feedback that you have on my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jen. Did anybody have any questions? Jean-Sébastien.
Yeah, hi. Well, thanks, Jen. I was wondering, you mentioned, using popular culture in some instances, such as with Matt Damon, to promote public health. But what do you make of, the consequences of people who are under the spotlight in popular culture? Think of Joe Rogan, who have been going against public health authorities in some instances and against the science. So isn't it kind of a double-edged sword if we start playing that game where it's like, listen to this one artist, but don't listen to the other guy? You're giving credibility when it comes to public health to people who don't have a background in public health.
Well, I think that's a very good question, Jean-Sebastien. So I think it comes back to this notion that we're going to be getting this information regardless. So whether Joe Rogan has been sanctioned by the government or not, he's going to be talking about COVID-19. And I think we can look to similar narratives in other popular culture texts as a counter perspective to the Joe Rogan. So it's like, yes, Joe Rogan is saying, you know, COVID's not real, or don't get vaccinated, or whatnot. But there are other types of products that we can look to that promote vaccination. And if there's a way that we can harness those from a public health lens, I do think we'll be able to reach audiences that might not be receptive to a traditional message.
Awesome. Thank you. Louise?
Hi. So I have a question. I think maybe it's also the question that is on the chat. So you've been doing your thesis for longer than the pandemic. How has the pandemic changed how you're approaching your theses? Can you tell us a little bit about how it was before, so we can see how it was, like what difference the pandemic has made?
Thank you for your question, Louise, and thank you, Danielle. I know the question, like you're saying, is a little bit similar. So my topic isn't COVID. I'm focusing on HIV and AIDS metaphors in particular with the novel series that I'm studying. But I do think that there are lessons learned that can be applied to current pandemics and other diseases. So that kind of addresses Danielle's question. And then for Louise, I think the biggest change for me is that I'm kind of approaching this project with a different lens. It still has a lot of its original roots. So the topic first came to me when I was in law school, learning about the criminalization of HIV and how people with HIV are treated by the legal system and then by extension by the media, because they are very much treated as monsters for transmitting this disease to someone else. And then that law has evolved over time. And I remember thinking about that, and I knew of this book series because I've been reading it for a long time. So again, like Brigida, when you're fans of something and you can turn it into your passion from an academic perspective, it's very fortunate. We're very lucky to be able to do that. But then I think with COVID, it became a bit more. So my project wasn't just this idea that I had when I was in law school, which came from working at UNAIDS as well, and learning about how certain communities and certain countries, when you're trying to move AIDS policy forward in a country that doesn't recognize LGBTQ rights, then you can't talk about AIDS from an LGBTQ perspective. You've got to talk about it from a women's rights perspective or an education perspective, or in some countries they'll move it forward by talking about it from a labor rights perspective if prostitution is legal. So knowing from practical experience that you need to frame things in a different perspective to reach different audiences kind of connects it with COVID and with this anti-vax movement, because the way that I see it is I'm like, okay, regular traditional public health narratives aren't reaching this population or these groups. And there's lots of reasons for that. Word of mouth is stronger, social networks is stronger, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm like, maybe we can use this. And, I thought that my dissertation was going to change the world when I first proposed it. And we'll be able to use something like my book series right away to get people vaccinated and get out of COVID. And I'm like, okay, maybe not so much. But I think that there's a place for it.
May I follow up with another question? So on this last point, what are your plans, or do you have plans for knowledge mobilization when you're done with your dissertation, and how you plan to put it out in the world?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's especially important because there was a workshop today from Research Impact Canada all about knowledge mobilization, and it's becoming super important for grants and funding. What my research has really taught me is it's more about the communication of policy. And so I love my topic. I'm really excited to be finished with it. I hope I can turn it into something to get published. But I come back to this idea of policy and how we communicate that to like everyday people who don't work in policy, who don't understand legal jargon or medical jargon or whatnot. And that's where I think the project is really interesting. I think my next route is going to be safe sport, just based on other activities that I've been involved in since starting at the Department of Communications and the University of Ottawa. But I think that there's a way to communicate these very challenging sensitive, controversial personal topics in a way that you can reach like younger populations, for example. So using comics to educate young students about issues that stem from safe sport, I think.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Was there any last questions before we wrap up this session?
Yes, I have a question for Jen. Jen, what was your sort of like light bulb moment to equate the word, like to sort of use vampirism as a metaphor for the criminalization of AIDS? I know you said you mentioned your interest in the novel series, but was sort of like your like light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, this is completely related?
It was that criminal law class that I took. And like I was saying, the way that people with HIV and AIDS are treated from the criminal justice perspective and from the legal perspective. In the novels, there's a very intricate legal system that exists. The novels actually begin by saying, 2 years ago, vampires gained legal citizenship status in the United States. And then as you progress, there's comparisons, but sparingly at the beginning and then more frequently at the end, which is what I was talking about in terms of like effective narratives and how to use metaphorical language, is you'll have comparisons to rabies, for example, when you're talking about werewolves originally. It's like, oh, it's just like getting bit by a rabid dog. And you're like, okay, that's interesting because rabies is a disease. So you're suggesting that lycanthropy is a disease. And then like a few books later, it's like, oh, if you're a werewolf, well, you can be discriminated against in the employment place, just like people with HIV and AIDS. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And so you start to see all of these kind of comparisons take place. But the light bulb moment for me was being immersed in the text, but I think the light bulb moment for others would come from this progressive building of the world that exists.
Do you feel like the discourses regarding COVID are similar to discourses of like zombies in horror films? I know it's like a far stretch, but
I would say yes and no. I haven't done a lot of analysis on it first and foremost. So, I might change my thoughts on that a little bit later. I think some of the early remnants of COVID were similar to zombie narratives. So like right as everything was going into lockdown in March of 2020, the streets were bare, nobody was out. And if you were walking, it was very eerie. It was just like, coming out of the first scene of a zombie movie kind of thing. There was something that I saw go by in the news recently that I think really kind of hit it home for me, which is this idea of stigma, which is what my presentation is about tomorrow. If anyone's attending the poster session, I'm plugging that in right now, Eliza, I hope that's okay. And how now that we've hit this new variant, which is so widespread, that the stigma of the disease is gone, that no one's really concerned about where you got it from because we're all going to get it anyway. HIV and AIDS is very different from that. It does carry a lot of stigma. In terms of a zombie narrative, I don't know if zombies are the best metaphor for the kinds of pandemics that we're currently in, and that has to do with the disease progression. But there are, I'm confident, other types of supernatural characters that we could use for a metaphor.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure many of us could keep asking questions and stay on this topic for quite a while longer. So if you want to touch base with Jenn again tomorrow, she will be in the poster presentation for an hour. So you can feel free to drop into her breakout room and have some discourse with her. So thank you very much, Jenn. That was a wonderful presentation and a great close to this session for the afternoon. Thank you all, everyone, for being here. Merci beaucoup nos présentatrices et vous qui regardez les sessions des maisons. So we will now be moving into our next session, which is the lecture series. And Jenn will actually be moderating this session, so I will hand the podium over to her.
Thank you, Eliza, and bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the Communication Lectures